உலகெங்கும் தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் TDSB.
Good afternoon, dear viewers. Thank you for tuning in. You're watching CrossRoads with Parthi Kandavel. Education, it goes without say, has always played a tremendously crucial role in our culture and society. For many parents, choosing the right school is of paramount importance. The right school is definitely connected to the school having the right teachers. In today's show, we'll be examining the position of teachers in our education system. We're joined with Sachin Maharaj, the author of a recently released education report entitled Effective Management in Human Capital. He's also a teacher in the Toronto District School Board. And Suzanne Reid, a vice principal at a Toronto District School Board high school. Thank you, Sachin. Thank you, Suzanne, for making the time for coming on our show. What inspired the show was a report that, Sachin, you recently authored entitled Effective Management in Human Capital. And I was curious to what prompted that report and why?
So the report was commissioned by the Canadian Council of Chief Executives as part of a series they're doing on skills training and education in Canada. They represent Canada's top 100 employers, so they obviously have an interest in making sure that Canadians are as educated as possible. Mm-hmm. And so they're doing reports in a number of different areas, higher education, other sort of skills areas, and they wanted to do a report on the K-12 system. Mm-hmm. And so they asked me to write this report for them.
And do you think the role of the Canadian Council of CEOs, as you mentioned, their interest is on what will certainly be future workers within at least the private sector for some. What is their concern prompted by? Is it our position in the global business world? Or is it the quality of our competencies by our workers? And
I think it's probably both of those things. So again, as Canada's leading businesses going forward, they obviously want to make sure that they have as educated and as skilled a workforce as possible to make sure Canada is competitive going forward. So that's kind of their interest, I think, in the topic.
Suzanne, as a former teacher of many years of experience and now in an administrative role, do you feel that is a legitimate concern by our business community and our business leadership of the quality of our students and our workforce?
Yeah, I think it is a legitimate concern. I read Sachin's report because my daughter brought it to my attention, saying there's this report that my friend has referred me to, and what do you think of it? So I had a little conversation with her about that. What struck me about the report, though, is it's one of the more contentious issues about teacher selection and teacher retention and teacher qualification and the best teachers for as many students as possible, particularly our most at-risk ones. And certainly it's deemed as the philosophy, if you like, of how we like to think that we educate our students. So. Certainly, I guess the challenge within education is that we're trying to educate as many students as possible for many jobs that don't even exist yet. The world is changing so very quickly, so one has to decide how we do this well for as many possibilities as possible. And there are certain pathways that we look at, but at the same time, education is not just for employment purposes. You want to build a better world. Okay. You want to build a better society. You want to build a better community.
Yeah, and that's very important. And I feel I think all of us have the experience of an important teacher playing a role in our lives that have led to something. And Sachin, you started your report off with the premise that teachers matter, right? And if you could elaborate on that and why do teachers matter?
So for a long time in education research, it was sort of thought that it was factors outside of the school and the classroom that played the largest role in how much students learn and how well students achieve in schools. With the teacher effectiveness research kind of in the last couple decades, we actually are for the first time understanding the tremendous role that teachers play in this process as well. And we know now that teachers can have profound effects on their students not just when they're in the classroom, but essentially for the rest of their lives. And so that's why one of the parts of the report talk about teachers matter, because they play a tremendous impact in the lives of our students.
And within your report, you took a critical approach to our selection process and the hiring process of teachers. I'm wondering if you can perhaps expand on one of your recommendations for that process.
So there was a few recommendations related to hiring that I gave. One was that hiring decisions as much as possible should be made by the local school principals so that they can hire teachers that meet their needs. Different school boards take different approaches to this, and sometimes they play differing roles in sort of the screening process. But as much as, if you look at the evidence on effective school systems, they tend to be the ones that leave those hiring decisions as much as possible to the local school principals. The second thing that I was saying, and this is more sort of related to Ontario, is that hiring should be based on merit and not heavily influenced on seniority. And that's something that's changed a bit recently in Ontario with Regulation 274, which was something the government introduced just recently. So it's kind of changed the way we hire teachers.
We'll come to the merit bit in a while, but Suzanne, as administrator and as a VP and hopefully as a principal one day, how do you feel about that process of having the ability to, or having a greater say in choosing the right teachers for your school as opposed to the board or superintendent who may or may not be disconnected from the local realities of the high school?
I don't think that superintendents are the ones that do like bulk hiring. That was never my understanding of it. My understanding of it is that principals still do retain the rights to hire for their individual schools, because who knows their schools better. If the regulations exist, we need to know what the regulation is and simply follow the guidelines as written. But my understanding is, and what I have seen in the schools in which I have worked, it is the principals that are making the decisions for the personnel in their schools.
On the topic of merit as a standard or as a yardstick for hiring, what are the current criteria, and what do you think it should be?
So, well, a couple things. I don't know if you wanted to touch on the seniority issue now or not, but basically how the hiring process works in schools and like in many professions, and I talk about this in the report, is we do hiring largely based on resumes and interviews, like we do in a lot of jobs. But we know that the evidence indicates that just having the required qualification or experience in that area isn't necessarily a good indicator of teacher quality. So that's why one of the recommendations that I give in the report is that we should actually have a demonstration of teaching practice before these hiring decisions can be made. Because we know that there are many people who might be able to perform very well in interviews, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the most effective teacher possible, or vice versa. You have some people who are great teachers that are just terrible at interviews. And so I think by taking a bit more time and maybe saying observe the prospective teacher teaching
In a class?
or in a similar class that they will be teaching, you can get a much better idea of who the best candidate would be.
On the surface, that seems like something would be advisable in a scenario such as teaching. Suzanne, how would that work on a practical level? Would that be something that as a principal you'd want to see somebody connect with the classroom and students?
I think that's the reason why we have references, why after they have had their interviews or even before that they submit references, and then you check back with administrator colleagues or even somebody that you have no idea who that person is. You've never met that administrator, but you trust that person and you ask. You ask the right questions, or you do ask. That's in many professions, that's how it is. I have actually met one teacher who mentioned that she had been for an interview at a particular school and was actually quite surprised when she was pretty much introduced to, here's the class that you may be teaching next year. Would you please teach whatever it was? And right off the cuff, she was asked to do a lesson.
Interesting.
She laughed about it. She said it was very, very interesting, and but I can't remember whether she told me she actually was offered the job there, but she did say it was one of the more interesting
Is there
interviews
scope
she'd had.
for principals and vice principals to incorporate that into the hiring process?
I would say that it provides a really interesting logistical challenge. It's a huge logistical challenge. I think teacher candidates who are in, you know, in the teachers' colleges or the faculties of education.
Right.
That's why their teacher supervisor evaluations are so important to some degree. At least that was the way it was when I was, you know, a teacher candidate. And we were sort of advised, you can't leave your placement unless you have in hand those various kinds of evaluations. And this was in part what would help you, since you had no other reference, would help you to get the job that you hope to get at some time in the future.
Sachin, can we rely on those evaluations and those references? Is it, as much as we have trust and faith in other educators, should that be, when you're dealing with the importance of, you know, young minds, can they be solely relied on?
So a couple of things about references. Just one in general, people when they're applying for jobs tend to only provide references that are going to give them a positive reference. So if you had an experience where you maybe didn't do that well, or the person doesn't think that highly of you, you're not that likely to include them as part of your reference. I do think the reports that teacher candidates get from teachers' colleges are pretty thorough. The question is whether the school boards have access to those full reports once they're hired. So I know, for example, when I was hired, that wasn't the case. So my evaluations were used for me to get my teaching license. But when I went to actually apply, they basically just phoned my references that I provided. So there's an opportunity for me or anyone else to kind of just put myself in the most positive light. So that's why I think spending a bit more time, and I appreciate it could be a big logistical challenge, but I think spending a bit more time is worth it in the long run. Because out of all the things that I mentioned there, that the report talks about, hiring, evaluation, and pay, I think hiring is actually probably the most important, because that's the most critical point in the whole system that will determine teacher quality going forward. Because once a teacher is hired, it's very difficult to say, remove a teacher if it's not the right fit, or it's a lot more costly later on to address some of these issues further down the line.
You know, one thing I've noticed as a teacher is that, and you know, as a student, you know, I think we're all students at all times, but you know, we connect with different teachers and educators dependent on their style of delivery and communication. So as a result, would it be unfair to apply one objective sense of teaching performance in one of those, you know, evaluations on teaching style?
Well, I think evaluations, any good evaluation and any good evaluator has to take into consideration the context that the teacher is teaching in. So someone teaching in, you know, a very academic setting will have to teach probably differently than someone in a very different setting. And I think those need to be taken into consideration. And whether you're teaching in a rural area or an inner city area or a suburban area, you're going to have a bunch of different challenges. But I don't think it's that difficult to take that into consideration. And I think administrators do that, you know, when they're doing the evaluations that exist right now.
On that topic of taking in the perhaps the demographics or the certain needs of a certain community, you know, one concern many communities or visible minority communities feel is that the teaching staff, whether it's at elementary or secondary level, is not as reflective as the student body. Is that a legitimate concern, and is that changing?
I really hesitate to, how should I say this? I think the reality is that if you're a teacher and you have a number of students who don't necessarily look like you, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do a bad job. You still have to make a connection anyway. And it doesn't have to be by what you look like. It could be what you sound like a little bit. If you're speaking some of the same language, or, you know, there has to be a connection, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, I don't think, an ethnic thing or a cultural thing. I think from the perspective of a high school teacher, I would say the ability to fire your students' imagination with your subject matter is huge. But you can't share the subject matter or really interest all of the kids in the subject matter if you haven't made some other kind of a connection. As in, I care about you, I care about your learning, I care about everybody in this room, and it's not just about you. You are one of many in a classroom for whom I, as the teacher, have a responsibility. And then you kind of move along in that way. sort of mutual respect and so on.
Did you come across that question in your report or in your...
So I didn't deal with that issue specifically in the report, but I agree with a lot of what Suzanne said. I mean, I think in general, it is important for students to have, say, positive role models in our schools, and our teaching force, as much as possible, should try to reflect that the community that we're serving. I think you run a danger if we're getting into, say, some like quotas or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily the solution. But I think a teacher from any background, a good teacher, can make a positive connection with their students, even if they're from different backgrounds. And I think that's a key part of being able to teach them effectively, is making that connection.
In your report, you also discussed the idea of teacher evaluations not being perhaps comprehensive enough. Can you elaborate on that, and also in terms of the consequences that come from evaluations?
Right, so a lot of the recommendations from my report came out of some of my own research, which was just published recently in a journal. And my research looked at specifically the evaluation process in Ontario from the perspective of administrators. I looked at a number of different areas, but a couple of the areas were whether administrators felt the evaluations were accurate reflections of teaching practice, whether it led to substantial improvements in teaching practice. Because there's two real purposes of teacher evaluations. One is to assess the teacher's level of performance and making sure they're above whatever the required standard is. And the second, and probably the more important part, is to result in increased professional growth, so to improve teaching practice. And most administrators in my research basically concluded that they didn't feel that the current process resulted in much improvements in teaching practice. And that was pretty consistent with other studies done from the perspectives of teachers, both in Ontario and in other provinces, that the evaluations processes that we have in Canadian schools don't really tend to result in a lot of improvement in teacher practice.
One approach that some education systems in the U.S. and perhaps some in Canada look at is through the yardstick of a standardized test. Do you feel that's a tool in evaluation of teacher performance and competency?
So the last recommendation in the report deals with that specifically, and it actually recommends against using student outcomes or student test scores in evaluations, mainly because it has been tried in a number of different school systems, mainly in the United States, and the evidence pretty conclusively shows it hasn't really worked well anywhere. So a lot of school districts have spent a lot of time and money implementing and developing these systems, and they don't really have a lot to show for it for a number of reasons. But basically, that's why I recommend against it. And I do recommend a bunch of other things that I think could improve and work with the evaluation systems that we have in place right now.
A lot of parents choose schools based on their EQAO scores. What are your thoughts on that, Suzanne, in terms of should standardized testing be continued, or has it become a divisive topic?
It's divisive. Right now, the EQAO tests that I have to deal with as a high school administrator are the grade 9 math scores, the math testing, and then the grade 10 literacy test. And the literacy test is pretty high stakes. It's a graduation requirement. You must pass it, and if you don't, then there is an opportunity to take an equivalent literacy course. The idea behind it is to try to provide at least a minimal benchmark or whatever it is agreed upon that you must have having graduated high school. And there's nothing per se wrong with that. Of course, the idea is that I don't think, at least in the high schools, parents choose the particular high school based on that. I think they're looking at stuff other than EQAO. They're looking at the programming at the school, the extracurriculars that may be offered, the other kinds of things that the school offers, generally speaking. And of course, depending on the catchment area that you live in, you are entitled to go to the school in your neighborhood in which you live. But then there is also optional attendance. The TDSB has a system whereby you can take your chances. Put in an application at another school that you think would better meet your child's needs. And then it's pulled out of a hat. We do not require a report card for that or any other kind of thing. I'm not as familiar with the elementary schools with people picking, but I know that some people
I think
do.
it's been a reality. The media is covered with people buying because, with young families and they're starting a life in a new neighborhood, they're looking to buy based on the EQAO school. However, it's time for a short break. Dear viewers, please join us after these brief announcements. Welcome back, dear viewers. I'm joined with Sachin Maharaj, a teacher in the TDSB, and Suzanne Reed, a vice principal in the TDSB, and we're discussing some very important education-related topics. Just before the break, we discussed the role EQAO or standardized testing plays. In the U.S., testing is used as a very common tool to evaluate states and schools based on the results. And as a result of these testing, the phenomenon of charter schools has emerged in the 90s and well into the 2000s. And the idea, for those unfamiliar with it, is that they're privately managed and run schools. However, they're publicly funded, and in most cases, admission is free. And quite a few of them have seen success within the U.S. system, where results have been shown to improve, and a lot of parents, as documented in that documentary, Waiting for Superman, are pleased and happy with the results. Sachin, you're familiar with that. Can you speak to it?
So the thing about charter schools, well, first off, in Canada, we don't really have a substantial charter system. We do have some in Alberta, but that's pretty much the only place. The thing about charter schools is we do have some really effective charter schools that have been able to do substantial things with pretty at-risk populations. So in Waiting for Superman, I believe they look at the Harlem Children's Zone, and another famous one is KIP, Knowledge is Power programs. The question really is whether the success that those schools have had are scalable, if you can actually replicate that on a much larger scale. And I think that's really where the challenge lies. Now, the most comprehensive research done on the US charter school systems have shown that on average, they're about as effective as the public schools. And part of the reasons for that is because although you have great charter schools like Harlem Children's Zone and KIP, you also have some really bad charter schools that actually do worse than their local public schools. So I don't think it's charter schools as a philosophy is the answer. It's a question of these practices that the really good charter schools are doing, whether we can maybe implement some of those things system-wide.
There's actually some photographs. I had the opportunity to visit a charter school in New Orleans, and if you look at the monitor over there, we can perhaps show some of the images that I've taken. This is in an area in New Orleans that was, faces chronic unemployment, high crime, tremendous social problems, and a lot of these children are 95% single mother families. And as a teacher and as an educator, I was really impressed by the level of education, the quality, and also the teacher performance and the delivery of education at that school in particular. I forget its name, but and the research I've seen is there's, when done well, it provides a lot of hope in areas that feel neglected and feel that they don't have the greatest hope for their children. In certain neighborhoods in Toronto, there's been that, perhaps not to the same extent, but similar realities exist. And what came about as a result in the last 20 years is the Afrocentric School Initiative in northwestern Toronto, which is a full K-8 school, and you have Afrocentric school with, curriculum in certain Scarborough areas. What are your thoughts, Suzanne, on the rationale behind that? And
we're always looking for success for students, however you measure that. So academic success, the graduation rates from high schools, and then the entry into a desired pathways. And so I would say that this is just one of several possibilities for students. I can't really speak to specifics of the Afrocentric schools. I don't work in one, and it's not something that's really been hugely on my radar. But certainly any programs that are instituted by various school boards, there has to be some research and some study into it before it's brought forward, because logistically it's a huge undertaking. I mean, when you talk about an elementary school that is K to 8, it didn't happen overnight. It would have been built in with a certain number of grades, and every year then you institute the next grade. So you have kindergarten, then kindergarten grade 1, kindergarten grade 1, grade 2, and so on. So now the Afrocentric school at the high school level certainly wouldn't appear as a grade 9 to 12. It's when those kids who have come through to grade 8, there is a place for them to go into grade 9, and then you get new students as well joining in.
So if I could touch on the Afrocentric schools as well, I think it's really good to be innovative and try new initiatives to increase the success of our students. But the one thing to keep in mind is, even if we have an Afrocentric K-8 school and even eventually an Afrocentric high school, the reality is that most of our African Canadian kids aren't going to be educated there. They're actually going to be educated in the rest of the system. So if we're concerned about increasing the achievement of a certain group of students, like our African Canadian students, we can't just say that that's necessarily the answer. We have to look for more system-wide initiatives.
And do you think there's, one of the, coming to the charter school initiative, which is premised on that the public school wasn't meeting the needs, or the motivation and the morale of the teachers wasn't there to really uplift what they were using, the testing scores as an indicator of the quality of teaching. Do you think there's a similar appetite within communities in Toronto for a similar approach that allows a private and a system that's devoid of a teachers union to find what they feel are the right teachers to teach to that community?
There might be. The thing about the U.S. So I was in San Francisco last year for a big educational research conference, and it's mainly U.S. researchers and educators, but there's a few international people as well. And one of the things that struck me was the huge disparities in the American education system. So even within the public school systems, you have schools that are funded, that receive, 3, 4, 5 times as much funding as other public schools. And we're not just talking fundraising, we're talking like actual per pupil funding. So there's large disparities that I think the US system faces. And I think as a whole, the US system is a lot lower performing than our system here in Canada. I think we're a lot more equitable, and because of that, even in our international standings, we're a lot higher achieving because of that. Now, that being said, we do have problems in some of our public schools, and depending on the areas that you live in. And I think that's why different initiatives are being tried in some of these areas. So for example, in the TDSB, we have the Model Schools program, which tries to increase supports and resources in some of these areas. And I think parents have been pretty responsive to that. So I don't know if there's an appetite to have a large-scale charter system, as you might say, in parts of the U.S., but I think there's an appetite to try new innovative things, perhaps within the public system.
A couple of years ago, the Toronto Life magazine did a study on fundraising within elementary schools across Toronto. And it was interesting how some areas in certain neighborhoods were raising $500,000 very easily amongst their parent body, whereas some schools are struggling to raise $5,000. And as a result, there's obviously tremendous inequity, but also a lack of opportunities, whether it's bringing in scientists in schools or field trips that really stir and inspire kids. Beyond the model schools approach, how, as a parent, how can you address that, and as a public board, how do you increase opportunity that would allow greater equity?
So I'll say a couple of things that sort of I've thought of. So one of the things that I think that kind of exacerbates some of the problems we might have in some of our at-risk schools and at-risk neighborhoods is where these problems are concentrated in specific schools. So although it's a little bit contentious, I've argued that we shouldn't necessarily say to students that you have to attend your local school, especially in sort of at-risk areas. So having more open enrollment like they do in, say, Vancouver or Edmonton, for example, I think is one thing we could do. The second thing, though, which I mentioned specifically in the report, is I think as much as possible we should have our most effective teachers, our best teachers, teaching our neediest students. And so we should offer incentives to teachers, our best teachers, to teach in these schools. And I think that is something that might address some of the concerns of the parents in these areas.
And how would you make that match? And as an administrator, do you find that to be the case that certain teachers are better suited to teach certain levels or certain grades?
You find that, yes, that's the reality of it. But you still have to, as a member of a department that was relatively cohesive before I became a vice principal, various kinds of decisions have to be made for everyone. It's the many and the few, or the one, or the many and the few, you know, those kinds of Star Trek types of conundrums. The expectation is that the teachers that you have in your building are capable. Some may be a little bit better at doing various kinds of things. And certainly we do try, as administrators, to place the more experienced ones, or the ones who are more effective and capable with various classes. The ones who aren't as capable, one tries to help them to become more capable. So the whole idea of collegiality has to be in that mix. One of the things that Sachin actually mentions in his report is the idea of senior teachers being the ones who get the senior classes, you know, the more academic ones and so on. But in my teaching career, at least the school that I worked in and others that I've heard of, that was much less the case. That was the old school way and the old boy way kind of thing. But that certainly went out the window for the times that I was teaching. We always said everyone has to do their fair share. You get a mix of junior and senior. And you have a mix of applied and academic, or university and college. And the whole idea is that if you as a senior teacher want to teach senior classes, they don't appear out of nowhere. It's your junior kids, so you entice them and you court them to become intrigued by your subject and want to take that at the senior level. So, you know, you want to teach senior physics, then you better do a good job in junior science, making physics really exciting to have that happen.
Okay. It's time for a short break. Dear viewers, please join us after these short announcements. Welcome back, dear viewers. Today on CrossRoads, we're discussing education with Sachin Maharaj and Susan Reed. Sachin, you know, in your report, you discussed the idea of evaluations perhaps lacking teeth. You know, and one thing within education circles we discuss is the idea of evaluations being known ahead of time. And, you know, teachers, of course, go prepare and for that evaluation with, you know, with added vigor and interest. Do evaluations serve a meaningful purpose? And also tied to that is the question of the specifics pronounced in the collective agreements, which, you know, state certain things that perhaps take away the teeth from the evaluation. Do you agree with that?
So that's why in the report I recommend a few things. One is not just having one classroom observation for the evaluation, but having multiple, more than one. You know, a teacher, sure, they prepare and have a great day that day, or alternatively, a teacher can have an off day when they're being evaluated. And I don't think just observing one class or one lesson gives an accurate representation of a teacher's performance. So that's why I recommend multiple evaluations and have observations, and having some of those be unannounced so that you can get more of an accurate representation of the day-to-day activities in the classroom. So I think that addresses some of those concerns. And I think in order to be able to do that, yeah, that would have to be changed in the collective agreements for sure.
And would that be, an example I cited during the break is that my cousin, who's a teacher in the UK, she's evaluated by independent people who are formerly teachers working with the board, independent of the school, and they are unannounced. So which creates the dynamic where a teacher has to be ready for every lesson every day.
So I think
would that.
So I recommend having both, actually, the principal or the vice principal involved and a neutral third party. Part of the reason you want the principal and vice principal involved is, well, one, as the leader of the school, they need to know, what's going on in their classrooms. And two, they, more than anyone, will understand, say, the local context of the school and the dynamics, which we talked about earlier. The reason you'd want a third party as well, though, is because if you look at the studies done on Canadian teacher evaluation systems from the perspective of teachers, a lot of teachers report that they don't always feel their evaluations are accurate, either because it's influenced by their relationship with their principal, or maybe they felt their principal didn't have the subject matter expertise to evaluate them accurately. So I think having that independent third party as well as the principal can give a more sort of full picture of a teacher's performance.
The idea of unannounced evaluations, what are your thoughts, Susan?
Well, if it's going to be written into the collective agreement, that's one thing. But I would say that most good administrators know their schools pretty well, and one of the things that they do, it's one of the things that I was told before I even got into the role, was know your school. Walk around. Do not stay behind a closed door. And I've taken those words to heart. I walk around my school daily.
And do you sit in on randomly?
I sometimes do. I do sit in. I just pop in. I say hello. Some of the teachers are surprised when I'm there. I snuck in just this past week and sat down in a class while she was taking roll call or just getting organized. And it was when she started counting up to make sure she had everybody that she realized she had one extra, and it was me. But yeah, I do drop in. I remember my own teacher evaluations as opportunities to show off what I could do. And I didn't necessarily stay in the classroom to do them. I took my class into Morningside Park, and my principal went along quite happily. And we had and I pulled it together in a few days because we wanted to take advantage of the good weather and a local area, using an area that is like an outdoor lab. And the teachers that I have evaluated so far sort of take that approach. It's an opportunity to show off my students and to show off some of the things that I do on a daily basis. And I have a quick word with the kids as well and say, how did you think the teacher did? Or is this the way they usually run their classes? Then they'll tell you. They'll say, yeah, they're kind of fun. And you don't pick the kid or you just ask. Just very quietly. It's not like, you have to tell me now, and stand there with your clipboard.
On that question, a lot of the recommendations you suggest will involve, if you were to implement it with the agreement of teacher unions.
Right.
What's the realistic kind of expectation of that, given the role they play in the whole policy process?
Well, I think it depends on the unions themselves. So I've had the opportunity to debate some of these recommendations with the heads of different unions of different provinces, and they've all responded differently. So
in Ontario?
Well, mainly in the two were Alberta and Manitoba. And when I was talking with the head of the Manitoba Teachers Society, he actually thought some of the recommendations in the report were actually good recommendations to implement, whereas other teacher unions, whether I've talked to them personally or in the media, were against most, if not all, of the recommendations. So I think it depends on the unions themselves. And I mean, ultimately, the unions are supposed to represent the teachers. So I think if there's an appetite or a change amongst teachers, you might see movement in some of these. So for example, in the US, The two largest teacher unions, the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, have adopted some of these recommendations and are a part of their collective agreements. So just because you have a teachers union, I don't think it necessarily means it's sort of antithetical to some of these reforms. It depends.
Do you think in Ontario in particular, because we're based in Ontario and all of us are connected to Education Ontario, if you look at the desire for change, and if these recommendations were to be pursued, which may result in labor strife, is it worth it, do you think, for any upheaval to happen in order to bring about change?
Well, I think, again, if you look at the US, where these reforms have been, some of these reforms anyway, have been implemented successfully, it's been done in partnership with teachers and teachers unions, as opposed to sort of a top-down, we're doing this to teachers. And so I think that's where you need to really engage teachers in part of these conversations going forward. And I think that would be the path that would have to happen here in Ontario, if it were to happen.
Within your position as an administrative role, how do you find the relationship between administration and teacher union leadership within your school environment in terms of bringing about change that you would like to see that would involve them coming on board?
It's been very amicable. We as a group, we have PLCs, which is professional learning communities, and it's not just a word, and for the kids, it's essentially another late start and an hour to sleep or do whatever. But we take that very seriously in trying to make sure that we are bringing research to the teachers to say, this is proven and effective. How does it work? How can we move this along for the success of our students? So various things like descriptive feedback, which simply means you give immediate feedback to students, very targeted, very specific, to help them to improve their performance on whatever it happens to be, is implemented. And there are examples. It's not just talking at you from some talking head outside. We have teachers within our school sharing with other teachers best practices. So, we have round robins. We've done that at least twice so far the last couple of years. We look at things like, we talk about critical thinking. What does that actually mean? What are higher order thinking skills? What does that actually mean? And how do you change tasks within an assignment? What are some of the products that the kids do?
And that's so a very important point in some of these non-quantifiable skills that need to be imparted. And can that be evaluated in teacher evaluations, how a teacher is able to develop critical thinking and high order thinking? Or is that something that's premised on trust?
Well, I think we try to capture that at least a bit in some of our teacher evaluations, at least in Ontario. Although there's a classroom observation component, we're supposed to take into consideration kind of the broader aspects of the teacher's planning and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's something that we do try to capture, and it can be done. That's why, again, in my report, I'm not suggesting, throwing out the evaluation systems that we have currently. I'm just making some recommendations in areas I think it can be improved.
Within at the secondary level, there are many who realize and understand that the quality of education, the quality of say the course subject matter varies from high school to high school, and universities look at marks that are ultimately subjectively based on the teacher and the school. There's talk of a US-style SAT examination to level the playing field in the sense that all students in grade 12 who are applying for post-secondary are evaluated on one metric that would allow universities to have some measure of an equitable admission process. Do you think there's legitimacy and value to that argument for Ontario?
There used to be external departmentals at one time that were delivered to the grade 13s, and those were your benchmark things. We have ministry curriculum documents that outline in some detail what needs to be covered when or where. So we have things that are called general expectations and specific expectations. And so the idea is that every school must be meeting in whatever, if you're offering a particular course, the general expectations. Some of the specifics may differ, but you are still covering course material. The individual teacher may cover it in slightly different ways, depending on, in part, I suppose, facilities. So my own discipline is in science. If you have a huge class where it is not safe to run particular hands-on experiments for every single child, you'll do it by demonstration or you'll do it in a group, those kinds of things. But they are supposed to be covered. I don't think you can, at this moment in time, I don't think it's possible to standardize every single exam. The cost that is associated with the EQAO alone is however many millions it is. And there are many criticisms of it, but the idea to me to try to do that for every single subject that is then presented at the universities can figure it out.
So yeah, I mean, having sort of system-wide testing does have its value in some areas. So going back to the EQAO, I remember seeing some data a few years back that said something like for grade 9 applied math, 73% of the students were passing and getting their credit, but when they actually wrote the EQAO, only like 23% were achieving at the provincial level. So sometimes you do see this discrepancy between kind of what's happening at the school level and kind of where we think knowledge should be. So, I mean, there is some merit in that, and I think it's good to know those things and take action on those things. Whether we should have an SAT-style entrance examination, I don't know if the pros of that would outweigh the cons. I mean, yeah, there can be, sure, some discrepancies in how courses are taught or how marks are awarded. The question is whether those discrepancies are large enough to merit sort of this system-wide testing. Because as soon as you introduce more of these high-stakes tests, especially something as high stakes as the SATs, you're going to have some adverse consequences for sure. Whether it's, what people already complain now about, teaching to the test for EQAOs. So that will be something that would happen even further. Do we want to take time away from students focused on their coursework where they're going to be cramming for these SATs? So you have to think about it kind of in its holistic sense, whether it's something we would really want to adopt here. And given that Canada is still a relatively high-performing country when it comes to education, and much more so than the US, I don't know if that's necessarily the route we should be going.
And as a final question on the topic of education reform, how do you find the approach and the appetite for that in, I guess, the Toronto board and Ontario as a whole?
So I'll say, since my report has been released, I found there's been a lot of public interest to talk about some of these conversations. And I had a reporter ask me one time, why do you think that is? And I think part of the reason is education, probably more so than any other public service, is the one we have the most experience with. So, you might go to a doctor, when you're sick or whatever, but all of us have been in schools for years of our lives, so it's very personal to all of us. So I think there is appetite to change things and debate these things and make changes where we think it will result in a better school system. And I think we have a pretty good track record, by the way, in Ontario. That's one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the report is, again, if you look at our track record, we have been getting better at what we're doing over time, and I think it's something we'll definitely should be able to continue to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Change is always hard, I think, at any level. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't reflect on past practice and where we should be going. And I think certainly in teacher evaluations, it gives an opportunity for people to actually reflect on what they've been doing. We ask the kids to do it. The way the curriculum is changing now in terms of evaluation for themselves, is it, what am I learning? What am I getting out of this? Why am I doing it? We ask the same of our teachers. As administrators, we have to do the same thing too.
Thank you, Sachin. Thank you, Suzanne, for making time today. Dear viewers, we hope our show shed light on an important issue that faces all of our community, as in the mainstream as well as within our own. We hope to see you next week. Thank you and have a good week.
உங்கள் டிவி.